Hi there. In this short tutorial I'm going to cover the variety of different types of lights that you can use in Blender. So to begin with, let's just make a basic scene so that we can see the effect of our lights. As normal, this is a tutorial specifically about cycles. There are some differences with lights once you switch over to Blender Internal. So this one, to remind you, is about cycles. So here's a basic plane. I'm just going to subdivide it and then just select these edges, E to extrude, and I'll just take them up a way and bring them out slightly. I'm also then going to add a cube, shrink it down a little bit, put that over here somewhere, and I'll add a UV sphere, put a subdivision surface on it and set it to smooth shading, just embedded in the background plane, and finally an icosphere with just a few subdivisions, and we'll put that over here somewhere. So we've got a few shapes just to show up how the different lights are working. So to begin with, the most useful but also most basic lights in Blender Cycles, and that is the sun lamp. So come down to lamps and we'll select sun. With the sun lamp, it doesn't actually matter where it is in the scene. So I'm going to open up another window. I'm just going to come over here and I'm going to reduce the number of preview samples so that we can see what's going on more quickly. And I'm going to turn off reflective caustics and refractive caustics. These are only really used when you're using glass-like or clear fluids and things like that, so we don't really need them. And this isn't anything to do with using the sun lamp, this is just for the demonstration. So I'm now going to set this side to rendered. And you can see we've got a fairly evenly illuminated scene with very few shadows at the moment. So I've got my sun selected and I'm going to rotate that. And as you can see, we're now getting some shadows appearing in the scene. It's a little dim, so let's put it up to 2.5 strength. I'm over here in the lamp properties. And you can see, obviously, we've got light reflecting off this side and illuminating here. So what controls how light reflects around the scene is bounces. All of the lamps have this function available in the most recent versions of Blender. But the max bounce is obviously the light is bouncing around, and therefore Blender is having to do more and more calculations as the light rays bounce around. So typically I will turn down max bounces. However, let's look at what happens if I turn it to 0. We've actually still got a fairly acceptable scene, but obviously no light is reaching this dark area because we're not permitting any bounces. But that said, it's a very clean scene. Even though this is only 10 samples, we have shadows, we have partial shadows, and very little noise. And that tells you something about how noise comes into being in cycle scenes. So I'll leave it like that for a moment and we'll have a look at size. Now obviously this object doesn't change in size, this virtual object, but what it effectively does is changes the size of the lamp itself. So if you have a very small point of light, shadows will be very hard. So if I turn this down to 0, you can now see that all of our shadows are very hard indeed. So much so that we're even seeing some artifacts on the sphere here. So if I now turn bounces up a little bit, immediately we start to get a little noise come back in the scene. Bear in mind this is only 10 samples, and it appears as though the shadows are softer, but in actual fact they aren't. Because if we zoom in on an area where there is a shadow, you can see that that's a very sharp switch between shadow and no shadow. So let's put max bounces back up to a reasonable number, 256. And now let's play around with the size. So as I turn the size up, what you can see is the shadow becomes much softer. So you can imagine this is now becoming a slightly overcast day. There's clouds perhaps moving in front of the sun. And then as we go up to a larger value again, you can see the shadows become very soft. And if I put this up all the way to 1, we almost don't have any shadows at all. The light is almost coming from all directions. But we've still got some shadows, just not very many. Now if I turn bounces down, that actually enhances the shadows slightly because of course there's no bounce light. Light only reflects once, it doesn't bounce around again. And that's actually quite an interesting sort of look. It's quite a stylized look, I rather like it. And it's very quick to render, of course. So let's put this back up, 256. Let's put the size down to 0.2. And that's like a fairly overcast day and a reasonably bright sun. Obviously, we can change the color of lights as well. And that can have some interesting effects. At the moment, all of my objects in my scene are basically a light grey to white colour, the default colour, and that's why they just reflect the same colour as is hitting them. But obviously if they were coloured, we'd get some different effects depending on the colour of the objects. But this is more about the lamps rather than that. So I'll set that back to white. And then one other thing about the sun lamp. So I'm going to set bounces back down to 0 again, just to make it easier to see this effect. And again, you can see even with 0 bounces, we have this slightly softened edge because of the size of the sun lamp. I'd have to set that down to 0 to get a completely sharp edge. I'll just put a little bit of softness on there. So what we need to remember is that with the sun lamp, it doesn't matter where it is in the scene. So I can put it down here, up here. You can see no effect. It's re-rendering, but no effect on the shadows. The only thing that affects the shadows from a sun lamp is the rotation of the sun lamp. Because in reality, this is simulating a sun that's at infinity. So they are effectively horizontal rays. They don't expand out as they leave the sun lamp. Normally, you put it somewhere that relates to the sun. So in other words, if I've got it at this angle, I'm thinking of the sun as up here somewhere. Nothing to stop me having it over here. But it can be a bit confusing, especially when you're trying to work out, for example, whether the sun rays will make it through a window. So normally you put it somewhere representative of your scene so you can see the angle that the light is going to be coming into it. And now, of course, if I rotate on the Y, you can see the sun is coming from the other side now. Or I rotate on the X, and now it's coming from the back. Or if I rotate the other way, it's coming more from the front. So it depends on obviously all the different values. And we can do the same by just rotating it on Z, which is generally what I do with the sun lamp. So in short, if I want this to seem like either very early morning or late evening, I would set the sun lamp to quite a shallow angle like that. I probably put the size up quite a bit. We'll have some bounces, and I'd have quite a reddish color. If on the other hand, I want this to simulate sun close to midday, it would be very steep angle like that. Perhaps add a little bit of angle. It's always worth having some angle on it, because if it's too steep, really your objects don't have shadows, unless that's obviously the effect that you're looking for. And perhaps 0.025, something like that for the size. How coloured you have it is up to you. So that's the sun lamp. Key thing to remember, the main things you're going to play with is the size and the angle of the sun lamp. The position in the scene is irrelevant to the rendering, but it's sometimes useful so that you can use this line. And you can scale the sun lamp like this, but it doesn't actually affect the rendering scale, but it can be useful if you're making a very small or very large scene to get that little indicator line somewhere useful. So I can either create a different lamp, or I can just click here, and I've now changed my sun lamp to a spot lamp. And the first thing that's obvious is, even though this cone that's appeared is appears to be shining into my scene, the scene is completely black. And the reason for that is that for some reason scaling in terms of strength, emission strength for a spot lamp is very different to that of a sun lamp. So 2 for a sun lamp is quite bright, for a spot lamp it's almost off. So if I put 1000, now we're starting to see it. You can see it's still even quite dim, so I'll put 2500, and it's certainly not full brightness. So you can see it's probably something like 2000 or more dimmer than a sun lamp. So some of the things about a spot lamp. So unlike a sun lamp, the position of the spot lamp does matter. As you can see, as I'm moving it around, it's illuminating different parts of the scene. The next thing, as is the case with several of the lamps, as the lamp gets closer, the light, or the strength of the light, gets stronger. So there's a fall off. You can see it falls off there and gets brighter here. I'm not going to go into the advanced settings, but there are settings in the node editor for you to control the way that fall off works for emission objects. A useful tool with the spot lamp is to show the cone. And now it sort of gives you an idea of what's being illuminated by the spot lamp. Again, we have size and max bounces, and they work exactly the same with the spot lamp as they do with the sun lamp. And one of the things you can do is change the angle of the cone. So we can turn this up, but goes all the way up to 180, so it's almost an area lamp at that point. Or turn it right the way down to a tiny little beam of light. But you notice it doesn't really affect the brightness of the lamp, it just controls the angle of it. It does affect the size of the blurriness at the edge. So if I turn max bounces down to 0 to make the scene a bit simpler, and I turn size down to 0, you can see we've got completely sharp shadows, and yet there's a blurry line around here, and that's this blend option. So if I turn that down to 0 as well, finally we've got a spot lamp which is completely hard edge. But as we turn blend up, you can see basically the shadows creep in from the sides. So that's a way to make a more realistic lamp, even with 0 size and 0 bounces. So if I turn bounces back on, the scene gets a bit noisier, but obviously we start to get a bit more light around the scene as it bounces off. And if I turn the size up and the blend down, so blend is at 0 now, but I'm going to turn the size of the lamp up. Again, we get that blurry edge. But what we also get, of course, it's hard to see at the moment, is we get more blurred shadows. It's not quite as pronounced as with the sun lamp, but it's still working in the same way. So again, you can play with all these different things to get the effect that you need. So I'm going to set that back to 0.1, which is the default. I'll set that to 256, and we'll go on to the next lamp. Before we go on though, I'm just going to turn this back down to 1. Now the hemisphere lamp doesn't actually work as a hemisphere lamp in Cycles. It does work in Blender Internal, but as you can see from the little message here, it says it's not supported, at least not currently, so it's interpreting it as a sun lamp. So you won't see any difference apart from the representation in the 3D viewport between a hemispherical lamp and a sun lamp. However, the area lamp does work. So I'm just turning the size of it up so you can see you actually get a little square section, and there's a little bit of light appearing down here. So again, it's dimmer than a sun lamp, but not as dim as a spot lamp. So we'll try 100. So default for a sun, have that somewhere between 1 and 4 typically. For a spot lamp, have that somewhere between 1000 and 4000, and for an area lamp, somewhere between 50 and 250 as your starting values for the brightness of your lamp. You notice we can also control the shape. So we can have a rectangular shape to our lamp, or we can have a square shape. It doesn't affect this icon, it affects the way that the light is cast. So it's as if there's a square or rectangular lamp shining into the area. And if I rotate this, you can see, a bit like a spotlight, it is directional. So it doesn't shine from both sides of that square. It illuminates an area very much like a directional lamp would. And you can see again, as I approach this surface, there's a fall off because it's much brighter there now. And again, of course, we get size and max bounces that we can play with. Multiple importance you'll see on all of these, as well as other settings, and typically you will use that only if you're using an HDRI to illuminate your scene, but I'll get onto HDRIs in a little bit. So that's all the default lamps. And one of the things I would say is, in order to minimize noise in your scene, try to use these when you can. There are occasions when they're not suitable, or you need to use other lamps as well, and I'll show you those now. So let's delete that lamp, and I'm going to add a simple plane. I'll put that there, and I'm going to go to materials this time and say new, and instead of a diffuse, I'm going to select emission, and immediately you can see we've illuminated our scene. Now, although I said in order to minimize noise to try to use the built-in lamps, there are reasons to use what are called mesh lamps, which is mesh objects like this plane with an emission shader on them. I'm just going to turn that up to full bright. And if you look over here, this is a much more natural illumination. Part of the reason for that is because we've now got a large area that light is being emitted from. So it gives us a softer light, and I think sometimes it's a more pleasing light, but as a result it can tend to be noisier. What you can do with this is you can play with physical size of the object. Now if I make this smaller, one of the first things that is obvious is the light actually gets dimmer. It's quite intuitive, so it's not really a surprise. So if I bring it down closer, again, there's obviously a fall off. And again, there are nodes that allow you to adjust this, but I'll cover those in a more advanced tutorial. And I can, if I scale this on the X, you can see we're getting more light coming from it. Perhaps turn the strength up over here. Put that at 3, so that's illuminating our scene again. But here's something to note. You can see we've got light coming off the top surface, light coming off the bottom surface, and it's obviously going in all sorts of directions. But one direction it doesn't really seem to be going in is this horizontal line in line with this plane. And that's because this plane has no thickness, and therefore there is no light being emitted in that direction. For the majority of uses, that's not an issue. You're not going to be too worried about that. But occasionally, especially when you want light close to objects, you may not want this dark line showing up. Quick and easy and dirty fix. Go into edit mode, press E and scale up just to give the object a little bit of thickness. And you can see when it's very thin, we've still got a horizontal line there, but as I make it thicker, enough light is emitted to start to erase that line until it completely disappears. So we've now got quite a nice lamp in that scene. Only problem is I don't necessarily want to see that lamp. I've just stopped rendering anything outside of the camera there. So I want to see the effect of the light. Maybe I even need the lamp quite close to my object, but I don't want to see the lamp itself in the scene. So that's pretty easy. Go to Object Properties, and under Ray Visibility, turn off Camera. And now you can see the lamp is illuminating the scene. We're seeing the light bouncing off the object, but we can't see the lamp itself. Now, just a little word of caution about this. I will make this sphere have a glossy shader on it. So let's put slightly silvery shader, and there it is over here. I'm going to come out of the camera view and just zoom in on it there. Now you can probably see just here, you can see obviously the scene is reflected in my sphere, but we've also got that bright lamp showing up in the scene as well. So that may or may not be what you want, but obviously the lamp is invisible directly, but it's still visible there. Now you can, again, come over to the object properties with the lamp selected and switch off glossy. And now the lamp has vanished from the scene. However, the more of these things you switch off, the less accurately your scene will be represented. So think very carefully about whether or not you want to hide the lamp in the scene. For example, if I turned off diffuse, the scene goes completely dark. If I just turned on glossy, there's the reflection. If I just turn on camera, there it is, but not the scene. So you need to think about whether that's what you want. Obviously you can make this much smaller, but in that case you'll need to make it much brighter. And again, the size of the lamp will affect how hard the shadows are. When I first started with Cycles, I tended to mostly create with mesh lamps. And in fact, my default lamps that I have in another layer, they are all mesh lamps. But I tend to use them less these days, especially when rendering animations. You don't want to have to render at a high number of samples in order to remove the noise, and therefore the default lamp tend to cause much less noise. So I'll remove that lamp. Here's another way of adding light to your scene. With the world selected, so look along this little control bar until you see the little world symbol. The default surface is background, and I can just set a colour, and immediately there is light in my scene. It's very diffuse light because obviously it's coming from everywhere. There's a little bit of shadow because of course this object isn't permitting light to come up this way. One of the better options for you getting light, especially for external scenes from the background, is to use the sky texture. So you can see it's all gone very blue there. But if I go to a layer without any objects, you can see what we've got is a rough approximation of a sky. There's a point at which it is quite light and then rapidly goes darker. And you can adjust how that looks. You can see it's almost as if there's a sun just off the screen there, and there you go, you can just about see there's a bright spot there, which is roughly where effectively the sun is coming from, and all I'm doing is clicking on this sphere and moving it around. You can adjust things like turbidity, which really is just adding dust into the atmosphere, and that's why it's becoming redder, and ground albedo, which is really how much light is reflected back up into the atmosphere from the ground. So if you put that up, basically it becomes lighter. So we go back to our scene. You can see already, although I haven't put any specific lights in the scene, we are getting some light in here. And we can vary the strength, so we can put this up to 2, make it quite a bright day. And you can see there is a certain amount of direction to this light. And if we come down to settings, and this will become more relevant when we use an HDRI, we can click multiple importance sample. In essence, what this does is it makes Blender look at the sky, whether it's an image or otherwise, as chunks. In this case, if I turn this on, 256K chunks, and determine an average brightness for that area from which to illuminate the scene. And the larger this number, the more accurate that is, but obviously that adds to the amount of memory used and potentially the render time. So I'll set that back to 256. And normally, certainly if you're using an HDRI, you do want to use multiple importance sample, as I'll show you now. So I'll turn that off, and we'll go to a new layer just so that you can see the sky. And I'm going to just remove that sky texture. And now I'm going to select environment texture, and we'll go to HDRIs, and this is one that I've actually created myself with Blender, and there are websites you can go to download them. So if we have a look around this, you can see it's rendering very quickly because although this looks like a 3D scene, it is actually just an environment. And you can see there's a bright spot there, which is where my sun is. Sometimes you'll need to add a sun lamp anyway and align the angle to the angle in your scene. You can see it's a fairly bright day and we've got very significant shadows in our desert here. So if I go to my scene, that's illuminating my scene, but I haven't got multiple importance sample on yet. Once I turn it on, you can see there is a difference. It's a softer illumination there. I'll turn this on, it's a brighter illumination. I've actually got that quite high at the moment anyway. But again, depending on your scene, you may or may not want to use an HDRI for it. You can turn it up quite a bit. And there are little tricks that you can do with the nodes to make it more significant. If we call up a different HDRI, so here I've got a different HDRI, you can just about see what it looks like here. And you can see we're getting a bit more shadows with it, and you can see the sun reflected here. But typically, especially if you've created them yourselves, you may well find that you need to add a sun lamp in as well. And just to show you what this HDRI looks like, there it is. And again, this was created in Blender, just a very simple scene with a load of bushes in it and some generated clouds. So really that's all there is to the basics of lamps in Cycles. So I hope you found that useful. If you did, let me know. If you enjoyed these tutorials, don't forget to click subscribe, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.